Before we get started, we really want to share with you our plans to take the podcast on the road. This means filming on-the-ground experiences in the U.S. and internationally, with in-the-field, face-to-face video interviews. It's an exciting yet ambitious undertaking, and we know we cannot do it without your help. If you feel inspired to join us in making this a reality, simply head over to the donate link in this episode's description. We cannot thank you enough for your continued support and your commitment to helping us share more of these wild stories and amazing people. Our guest on the podcast today comes to us from Belfast. He is an environmental social scientist of Queen's University in Belfast. He also has a PhD in snow leopard conservation from the University of Cambridge. He just published his first book, which we're going to really dive deep today, Living with Lynx, sharing landscapes with big cats, wolves, and bears. And he is Jonny Hanson. Jonny, it's a pleasure to meet you. And as I spoke to you before we started recording, this book is incredibly fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to speaking with you about it. How are you doing today?
Not too bad. The sun is shining here in Belfast, which is a bit of a rarity on the island of Ireland. So we're making the most of it and enjoying it. It's great to be on the show. That said, I have an admission to make at the outset, which is this, John, that I'm actually a cat guy. I mean, I do like wolves, but I'm a cat guy first and foremost. So as long as you or any of your listeners aren't going to hold that against me.
I don't think so. We are actually expanding our reach, and we've done wolves to the best of our ability. And I think we've been welcomed in that community, and we really love to expand because we do believe that wolves and a lot of these other predators, such as, lynx, mountain lion, bear, they're all interconnected. And so this is really why this book and your mission or your way to go through this has been such a, again, it really just hits me because you really dive deep into a lot of these different factors we're going to get into about coexistence. And we're really trying to expand that. So cats for me are good. I have two of my own. So it's two little guys, not two lynx.
Yeah.
Let me put that out there, make that statement. But it's a completely different shift from when you've had dogs your entire life. And I know you talk about that in the book too, about dogs, but give everybody just a background on yourself. Where did you grow up? Could you talk also about being the first community-owned farm in Ireland? You were a social entrepreneur in that way. Mm-hmm. Where did you grow up? How did that happen? And when did farming and large carnivores really begin to intertwine in your life?
Yeah, so as you say, I have this really unusual background of having a foot in the large carnivore conservation world and a foot in the farming world. And that's because of my unusual background in that although I was born in Northern Ireland, I grew up partly in a rural farming community in Ireland in my primary school years and spent all of that immersed in farming. And my parents didn't farm, but friends, community farmed. So around farming and also valuing it for farming as a process, but also as farmers, as guardians and custodians of landscapes and wildlife and nature as well. But I was also consuming just vast quantities of particularly large carnivore conservation via Nat Geo and David Attenborough and anything I could get my hands on. When I was 11, though, my family and I went to live in Malawi in Southern Africa. And what changed for me was these species, particularly apex predators, but just big charismatic megafauna, to use the technical term in general, went from being something that I saw on the silver screen or that I read about in a book to something that I got to see in real life. And not only in the national parks and the game reserves of Malawi and South Africa, those are the places that we associate having lions and wild dogs and leopards in. But I also saw them and encountered them on the edges of the city that we lived in, which at the time was one of the world's fastest growing cities, Blantyre in Southern Africa. And yet on the edge of that city were breeding populations of spotted hyena, leopards, rarely saw them or even signs of them, but they were there. So I grew accustomed to being in landscapes where apex predators were present. But I also began to see the challenges of, for example, expanding urban areas coming into contact with wildlife, but also sometimes on the other side, those big, particularly pachyderms, so things like elephants coming into a community and just eating an entire family's maize crop in a single night, and they're just having a snack, and yet there's an acre of maize just gone. And I began to, as a group became an adult, understand some of the complexities and the nuances, and perhaps how that rural community living on the edge of existence, their view of elephants might be very different from mine. Where I was sitting in relative comfort and affluence in an urban area, and that upbringing of Ireland and Africa, of farming and conservation, of starting to see things then from different perspectives, really laid the foundation for what I went on to do and give me, I guess, a good start in life in terms of understanding this from multiple angles.
As you said, it's so complex when we talk about cultures, different farming communities, livestock herding operations, being able to coexist. And as you mentioned, not just with carnivores and predators, but also with large herbivores. So elephants, I know, have been a topic for I'm sure generations of communities that live in those areas where elephants, as you say, come through and wipe out an entire crop in one night. So this is such a complex issue, as you've stated. Talk about Ireland and England specifically, because this is really the topic of your book here. And the story, just give a basic, if you can, historical overview of the landscape before these large predators were extirpated. And I like that you made the specific notion in the book. They aren't extinct from, obviously, because they still live in other places, just extirpated from these two countries in particular. So what was that landscape like, just to start, to give everybody a background?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it depends a bit on the species, the time frame. So if we talk about wolves, we're going back hundreds of years. Lynx, 500 to 1500 years, depending on point of view. With bears, probably 1,000. So a lot of variation there in terms of when the particular species. But before we get a lot of very angry Welsh and Scottish people writing in or hurling abuse in social media, I'm talking about the island of Ireland. And then I'm talking about the island of Britain, which is not just England. As much as the English may like to think that Britain equals England, it doesn't. There's also Scotland and there's also Wales. But this is important in this debate because those were often, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, were often the wilder parts of these two islands. And those were often then the last parts of these two islands where these species existed, because England was much more intensively farmed and managed, and we pushed these species, as we have in North America and elsewhere, we pushed them to the edges, we pushed them to the mountains, we pushed them to the wilder parts. And it's no surprise then, as we'll get into later, that these wilder parts, Wales, especially Scotland, to a lesser extent Ireland, those are where we're now discussing about having these species back. But absolutely, I suppose it's fair to say that going back hundreds of thousands of years ago, there were a lot less people on these islands. So it was less intensively farmed and less densely populated. So when we come to think about having these species back, that is something to bear in mind, that we just have a lot more demands on land. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, Mark Twain famously quipped, he said, "Buy land, they're not making it anymore." So in other words, there is a fixed supply of land. But as we hit 9 billion people and increase demands for food and energy, but also for wildlife, and these multiple visions of the land from 9 billion citizens of planet Earth, the supply of land may be fixed, but the demands on it are increasing. And that is often at the root of a lot of the conflicts. And it's so often, when you look at human history, it's about land. It's about who gets to do what with land, when, where, and why. And certainly if you peel back the initial layers of losing lynx and bears and wolves in Britain and Ireland, especially with wolves, it's about these animals as symbolizing wildness and the challenges that come for livestock owners in particular, and about getting rid of them as a way of kind of civilizing, quote unquote, civilizing the land. So who gets to do what with land was at the core of these animals departing from our shores, but it's also at the center of the debate about bringing them back. The land is everything.
It really is. And we're going to touch on this too, because I love that you put this in the book too, about the scope of language and what that means in terms of what is wild, what is considered wild, quote unquote, when we use the terms rewild and reintroduce, and what those emotions get evoked from people there. when we go back, and just because I do enjoy history very much, and so when we travel back in time to a degree, and I know nobody's a perfect teller of history, but it does seem that I guess when you talk about who rules the land, was this in part when we talk about I guess who would have been in charge of the land at that point, making these decisions to cultivate, to extirpate, to do all these things? Are we talking about kings and queens? Are we talking about tribes? Are we who could have been in charge at those points in time where these wild critters were being forced into smaller and smaller spaces until ultimately there was nowhere left for them to go?
Yeah, it's a good question because when we talk about who gets to do what with land, where, when, and why, it's ultimately about power. Economics are often in there as well, which I'll come to in a minute. But as you've hinted at, especially with wolves, the evidence for with lynx and how we coexisted with them is very sparse. Also with bears, but we have really good historical records of lynx existing in these islands, 16th, almost to the end of the 1700s in Ireland. And there's definitely a pattern emerging in England with uh, land being set aside for royal hunting establishments. So wolves being a threat to the king's deer park, or royal or nobility's deer park. Also from upland areas with the wool trade in the medieval era, which was really important and had a very strong monastic. So monasteries being involved in that was very, very valuable economically. So again, wolves were a threat to that. But the most recent, and to me the most interesting, is from Ireland, where we had around about the 1600s a guy called Oliver Cromwell who had replaced the British monarchy, but he went on a bit of a rampage in Ireland. He's not very popular in Ireland whatsoever. Ethnic cleansing and sacking of cities and all the rest of it. But he also instituted a systematic extermination and bounty system for wolves, not necessarily because he hated wolves, but it was a way to speed up the symbolic and actual colonization of Ireland. So as he cleared the land of quote unquote the uncivilized Irish, he brought in English and Scottish settlers, and the wolves, getting rid of wolves was a way to change who controlled the land, to make it settled, and then, as also happened in North America, to start cultivating and changing forest into field. So power has always been at the root of this, and also economics as well. So we should, when we look at it today, and power and economics are still there, again, it's good to lift the lid and instead of just thinking, bad farmers who don't like wolves, understand sometimes the more complex nuances about who owns land, the economic forces that are driving farmers' behavior one way or another. It's good to think about what's going on underneath as well.
You brought up the monastery angle, and I can only imagine there is some religious undertone in some of what was happening in terms of extirpation, economic driving, and making sure that, as you say, there was a cultivation of the land itself and making something, I'll use the word quote unquote pure. And so that it's, like you said, driving economics, making sure that everyone, it seemed, was in lockstep with what was the advancement of evolutionary history in, say, Ireland and Britain. Is there any truth to that? And what have you seen? Does this then trickle down into stories and language and mythology surrounding these predators, lynx, bear, and wolf, in that these are negative things on the landscape and they need to be purged?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, I'm actually a historian by training originally, but at the same time, there are others who have written weighty tomes on the history of all of this, including on wolves in Ireland. And first and foremost, I wanted to keep this. I call it adventure science, so it's part popular science, part adventure travelogue. So in some parts, I feel that I was just galloping through history. But to give you one example from the patron saint of Ireland, who's called St. Patrick. And the town where I live, just north of Belfast, there's a little hill outside of it where he herded livestock in around the 4th, 5th century. And he refers to people that he doesn't like as being wolves who are threatening the flock. And he's talking about, it's a theological debate, but he's using wolves to symbolize bad people, basically. So in that single vignette, there is that age-old vilification of wolves, especially apex predators in general, and it's not just St. Patrick. I mean, we see it in Disney stories, we see it in DreamWorks, we see it in the modern day multi-million pound blockbusters. That old tired tale of the apex predator being the villain is very much alive and kicking. And a special shout out to my favorite villain, who is Tai Lung from Kung Fu Panda. So obviously in stories where it's all animal, even then, it's not the panda who's the villain, or even therefore the tiger in that one who's the villain. It's the snow leopard is the villain. But those stories, they're buried deep in our psyche and they're buried deep in our culture. So when we start to have conversations about having these animals back, we may mock fairy tales, but Little Red Riding Hood has a lot to answer for. It's deep, deep within us, John, these stories.
You're right. And you make a huge case study surrounding the way Beauty and the Beast hit you as a younger individual, and the way that your psyche was in that you had a love, I don't want to say a love-hate, but there was a love-fear relationship with that story, and how the psyche drives the thinking, not just of the individual, but also of the groups with which those stories and mythology are passed down.
Yeah, 100%. So certainly with Beauty and the Beast, I had a childhood fear, if not phobia, of that particular story and the wolves within it. And I use it in the book just to playfully illustrate the point that, as I just said, these relationships are buried deep. They go back to the plains of Africa. You go back long enough, we're all African, not just people like me who had the good fortune to grow up in it, partly. And on the plains of Africa, as our species evolved 200,000 plus years ago, we competed with these species, with apex predators in particular. We were hunted by them. We hunted them. And I theorize, because I'm not a psychologist and definitely not an evolutionary psychologist, but I theorize that some of those old relationships are still within us, and that can lead to that instinctive response, which is often fear. And I'll give you one example to jump forward to 2023 when I was in Montana in the Tom Minor Basin, which is one of the highest densities of grizzly bears in North America, walking around there by myself in the middle of the woods. I felt fear, and I knew that I wasn't top of the food chain, and I had my bear spray and everything, and I'm bear aware and all the rest of it. But still, there's something that just de-evolves us in that moment to go back to the plains of Africa 200,000 years ago. At the same time, I talk about in the book how, as we started to develop culture, which at the beginning was probably just sharing stories around campfires, that yes, there was the fear, but at the same time, we also appreciated these species as beautiful and majestic. We admired them. It wasn't that we just feared them. And that sense of wonder then, as religious beliefs started to become canonized around campfires, became worship in some cases. So my point is that often with predators, we have quite polarized perspectives. We can have the fear, but we can also have the wonder. We can have the love, and we can have the hate. And sometimes we hold those within us, but increasingly we hold those in different tribes. And we see that today in conflicts over carnivores the world over. The love and the hate, the wonder and the fear, the romanticizing and the demonizing. And that is those old emotions, John, I think are still at the root of a lot of conflict over wolves, lynxes, bears, snow leopards, because essentially our relationship with these species is not just something that we know. It's not just about knowledge. It's something also that we feel, and it's about emotions as well.
Yeah, and emotions always ride high. I want to touch on really the prey species too around this time, or it can be historical and obviously moving into now, because there is this parallel where we covet or we love, whether it be ungulate species, sometimes a little bit more, and that can go from the wild game, whether it's roe deer, elk, whatever prey species are native to Ireland and Britain. Please go into that too. But how did you see, or how did you or how did this come to pass that we treasured these hoofed animals a little bit more in terms of prey species and not only wild but domestic when we get into sheep and livestock? Why is there such that polarization of fear and love? Is it simply economic or is there something deeper there?
I think I was thinking about this when I was writing the book, that we're talking about core foundational beliefs, old memories and experiences, that because a lot of the conflict, those emotions, and particularly the fear with towards large carnivores came in the earliest days because we were competing with them, and we were competing with them for as hunters for wild prey. And then that also extended then 10,000 years ago when we started to domesticate those wild prey and they became livestock. The competition just entered a different phase. And the same conflict or feelings are not there. We're not there in Britain and Ireland. We kept most of the large herbivores, particularly deer species, um, because I guess we needed them. There was something we could use. There was a value. They were meat. They were sport. They were a bunch of different things in a way that apex predators largely weren't, and that most of those species have carried on, and now again, as it relates to their return, we have often in many parts of Britain and Ireland an overpopulation of deer, and both native deer species, so the roes and the reds, but also overpopulations of invasive deer species, so sika deer, Chinese water deer, muntjac deer. And therefore, much of the discussion about their return is these species, particularly lynx and wolves, will help with roe with lynx and red with wolves, but also in that mix, in a changed environment, are invasive species that these apex predators may also help to control in terms of changing their numbers and their behavior.
And it's a perfect lead into my next question there about that is ecologically what was or is being witnessed, because once you extirpate the thing that kills the other thing, ecologically there has to be an imbalance somewhere. So was anyone witnessing this, or was it too busy driving forward the economic engine of the time? Or are we starting to realize now in present day in both of these countries that ecologically there is some form of imbalance, and why these conversations are starting to be had because of the overpopulation of prey species?
Yeah, this is where it gets a bit tricky and nuanced, because because of the timescales involved compared to the US, where I think you had even wolves in the Greater Yellowstone area until the 1920s. You're talking maybe 100 years in most parts of the lower
Right.
48, roughly. Whereas we're talking much longer time periods in Britain and Ireland of 200 to 400 to 500 years. So in that time, and even from my reading of the scientific literature in Yellowstone between the 1920s and the 1990s, ecosystems will always try to find some sort of equilibria, some sort of dynamic equilibrium and balance. And I think, and I'm speculating a bit here, in Britain and Ireland, that absence of apex predators, the gap may have been taken up by increasing hunting by people as the human population expanded. I suspect. I didn't go into that in great detail in the book, so if there's others listening who have
Sure.
more knowledge on that, that's fine. And partly because there is less hunting in the last couple of years and decades in Britain and Ireland, that appears to be one of the causes then of this rapid growth in deer populations that is causing a lot of ecological damage and preventing reforestation in many places. So I'm an environmental social scientist rather than an environmental scientist, I would say, but I would be wary of the simplistic wolves change rivers, Yellowstone narrative, where wolves alone were responsible for ecological renewal. In an ecosystem, there are always multiple factors at work. And that is especially so in ecosystems which are transformed or dominated by people, because we have cars and farms and invasive species. So the caveat with the return of these species by recolonization in Europe, or potentially one day in Britain and Ireland, is that there will be probably significant ecological benefit, but there is nuance, complexity, and uncertainty as well.
Of course. And I think to your point too about the wolves change rivers point, which there's obviously been some back and forth on this too.
Yeah.
I think the one there is an animal that there is some focus on it. The beaver gets I think a little bit of, it depends on who you speak to. Beavers were very instrumental too in that once wolves were reintroduced, beavers were able to change sort of the flow of rivers and things. So yeah, it's a multi-complex system in that certain keystone species like wolves and beaver, and in maybe this case, lynx, seem really to be the link, no pun intended there, to
The missing
start
link.
the missing link to be able to make some of these changes and create an ecological or sort of rectify an ecological imbalance that's starting to happen now, as you say, as cultures shift over time. And if hunting, it doesn't seem to be as intertwined in the cultures of England and Ireland per se, as it is more so, say, in the United States and North America, where there is, there are hunters that go out and, look to, get their elk or their deer or their moose or whatever that may be.
Yeah.
So there is some form of, believe it or not, coexistence happening with these predators on the landscape in that the prey species can't get too out of control, even though we do have in certain states ungulate populations exploding over the course of, certain instances because the predator base is not there to ecologically keep them in check, which is what they do naturally and instinctively.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go into, because this I know we kind of went around slightly, and that's, because I wanted to touch back on the prey species a little bit there. When you touch on this interesting model called IFS, which is internal family systems, when it concerns, we'll talk about just strictly predators in this instance.
Yeah.
Talk about this model because you have a couple of stories in there where you talk about an XL bully, you talk about, Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
So it's really getting back into this, I wouldn't say emotional, but I guess the way that our brain is starting to perceive what is good, what is bad, what is love, what is hate in some of these instances where we come across predators or prey or different species. You mentioned bear when you were hiking in Montana there in 2023. Describe the model and just give an idea of what it actually means and how it can change our perceptions of really these predators.
Yeah, so I have experienced psychotherapy myself, and currently at the moment actually with internal family systems, which is this very fast growing model of psychotherapy which seeks to understand human beings as having multiple parts to their personality. And the best example I can give you of that is if you've watched the Inside Out movies, either one or two or both, really, really good. A good San Francisco, California link as well. And if you think about the protagonist, Riley, she has these multiple personality islands, and there's just these different emotions and parts within her that together co-create her personality. And I brought that to bear on this topic of our relationship with apex predators because I myself felt like I had all of these competing thoughts, beliefs, and emotions on large predators, partly because of my background with a foot in the farming world and a foot in the large carnivore world, but also growing up in the north of Ireland at the end of the Troubles and just seeing conflict between different groups over things. All of these parts of my personality were meaning that I was feeling all these competing and sometimes contradictory emotions about having these animals back, in that a part of me absolutely loves the idea of having apex predators back. And if I lived in an ideal world and could wave my magic wand, I would do it. But at the same time, the pragmatic part of me knows that I don't live in an ideal world and I don't have a magic wand, and that to get to that point is going to involve a lot of cost and complexity. The part of me that has run a small farm knows that it's a tough gig. Profit margins are tight, days are long. It is the hardest job I've ever done in my life. And I wonder how that would work for similar small scale farms, having to relearn how to coexist with carnivores by changing how they farm, as farmers across Europe are having to do as carnivores recover and recolonize in extraordinary ways the continent of Europe. And my point is, I was trying to explain, and in the book, I try to explain how it makes sense that I can hold all of these points of view at the same time and still be sane and still function. And it's just also then to go beyond that, it makes the point that if I can hold multiple views on large carnivores and their return, then I can better understand how other people hold multiple points of view on large carnivores and their return. That these are complex creatures with whom we have complex relationships. And my idea in applying internal family systems to coexistence is just to help us really to walk a mile in other people's shoes, whether we're wolf conservationists, we're ranchers, we're lynx reintroducers, we're sheep farmers, is to try and understand others' perspectives.
How are you able to wrap your head around these situations? Because coming from a little bit of a background of farming, what are some of the things that crop up, again, no pun intended, in these situations with relearning how to farm, herd, do anything related to working the land when something that's been gone for centuries is now possibly on the brink to come back from your own personal experience? What are the things that combat inside of you and that you could relate to others in your situation?
Yeah, I guess again, this is where my background, the rigor of my academic training, doing a PhD at the University of Cambridge, and then the rigor of setting up and running a small farm from scratch. I look at this issue now through those two lenses of my intellectual hat, where I'm trained to rigorously deconstruct ideas and then put them back together and apply theory and then check it. And through that lens, I look at this issue and I think, what does the literature say? What does the evidence say? What does the science say? What does the social science say? What does the history say? But at the same time, as the old military adage goes, amateurs worry about strategy and professionals worry about logistics. So with the other lens of running a small farm, I think of myself standing in that field and I say to myself, how would changing my farming practice to have, if large carnivores were back in this landscape, how would it affect my daily routine? How would it affect the bottom line of the farm that I ran, albeit it was a social enterprise rather than a family business? And how would it affect my way of life? And so I look at this issue now, and I've written the book by trying to look at it through those two overlapping lenses, which is quite an unusual and I think powerful way to go about this, because we can theorize about this, and we can theorize about what would Will's Change Rivers thesis look like in Britain or look like in Ireland. But at the end of the day, we also have to think about the practicalities of how this could potentially change farming and ways of life, not just in terms of the actual risk, which is quite low. If you look at in space and time across human history and the world, the number of livestock that we have lost to apex predators, is highly unlikely to be top of the list. Top of the list will be climate and disease and probably human beings stealing other people's livestock. I'd say that's really high up the list. It certainly was in Irish history. Maybe let's say apex predators, again, theorizing here, let's say they're number 4 or 5. But because of our evolutionary past and our back catalogue of fairy tales, those relatively low levels of risk are refracted through that lens and become much greater levels of perceived risk. So there's the actual risk to livestock from apex predators, which is quite small statistically, but then there's the perception that the big bad wolf is going to come back to Britain and Ireland and not just eat your livestock, but maybe eat granny too. That perception is very much alive and kicking. And then the third element of risk, which I would add, is the symbolic risk. And what I mean by that is that, as we've alluded to already, these species are not just biological beings that wander the landscapes of the world around us. They're also psychological symbols or totems that wander the landscapes of the world within us. And so when I wandered the landscapes of Western Europe, researching my book, and also North America, I encountered people for whom the return of the wolf symbolized the death of a way of life, or the potential death of a way of life. I met people who thought that either Washington or Brussels, depending on which continent you're on, were using wolves to get rid of farmers from the land. And the fact is, wolves are not doing that, but they become a lodestone for, or a lightning rod for discontent about a whole lot of other, often political and economic issues, trade deals, the fact that farming is becoming harder economically and financially, or that it's becoming more precarious because of climate change, all sorts of other factors. It just so happens often apex predators can be a whipping boy or an accessible means to vent that frustration. And I think we see that a lot. And that's what I mean by the symbolism of these animals for farming communities.
Is it the same? Wolves always get the brunt end of any of these conversations.
Mm.
Is it similar? Do you see in the research for the book and as you're traveling across, because we discussed that lynx seem to be the first thing that could possibly be introduced. Is there this across the board or generalized idea of symbolism that carries itself with the lynx the same as it does with the wolf? Or is there some grace being given because it's a cat, it's a lesser being? I don't know. What are some of the factors there that you saw?
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things with Lynx. Well, firstly, in Britain and Ireland, most people think, I would say, that Lynx is a deodorant brand for teenagers. I think in Europe and North America, it's AXA, AXA. I don't know what, is that what you call it in North America?
Axe, I think
Axe,
you're talking
yeah.
about. AXE,
Okay.
yeah, Axe, yeah.
Whereas for some reason in Britain and Ireland, it's called Lynx. So I reckon most citizens of Britain and Ireland think that's what a lynx is. So one of the only good things about the recent illegal release of 4 Eurasian lynx into the Scottish Highlands at the start of this year is I hope more people in Britain and Ireland now know that it is a tufty-eared cat that we used to have in these islands and we may well have in the future. But that lack of knowledge, particularly in Britain and Ireland, because we're talking about in Britain probably 1500 years since we had lynx. And in Ireland, we may never have had lynx. There's very little evidence, one piece of evidence from 9,000 years ago. So there's just I guess there's a blank space on the mental map of what people think when it comes to lynx. In other places, I'm writing a paper with a colleague who's a specialist in medieval and early modern literature. In Europe, in that period, the lynx had this very strong symbolic association with science, actually. And there was a lot of talk about the vision of the lynx, and it became, and also like the tears of the lynx, or even the urine of the lynx, that it could be used for, had almost miraculous properties. So in other cultures where lynx are present, the lynx has become symbolic. It just so happens in Britain and Ireland, we don't have that recent cultural memory of the species. And in some ways, that's a good thing. In other ways, what I see with the lynx in Britain especially is that it is becoming totemic and symbolic. It is, on one hand, being seen as a symbol of a wilder Britain, and especially a wilder Scotland, which is the most likely location for the reintroduction of the species. And amongst some of the sheep farmers that I was speaking to earlier this year as well, who feel threatened by these plans, it is the other extreme. It's not being romanticized, it's being demonized, and people are worried about potentially the threats to them, human life, and their children and their pets as well. So I would say that the lynx doesn't have the same symbolism that the wolf has had, but make no mistake, it is acquiring that, especially in Britain at the moment with recent events.
And that obviously speaks to some of the factors when you talk about predator reintroduction or recovery in this instance. I mean, what would you classify it as with these efforts? Are we talking about reintroduction? Is it a recovery effort? Does the verbiage really matter in that sense? And logistically, does it seem like there's space for this to happen, meaning literal space? Because we talked about land early on, and how land is so coveted. Is there a place to start the small baby steps with something as big as this?
Yeah, I don't know that the language matters a great deal, whether you call it rewilding with lynx, reintroduction with lynx, recovery. What it is not in Britain and Ireland is a recolonization, because off two bodies of water called the English Channel and the Irish Sea. And that adds additional complexity because whereas we've said there are some challenges in Western Europe amongst rural communities who are finding it hard to relearn how to live with wolves, at the same time, those wolves have brought themselves back. There's been more in terms of lynx reintroductions, but also lynx have recolonized, bears have recolonized, sometimes with reintroduction assistance. But generally speaking, most of that has been recolonization. That can't happen in Britain and Ireland. And that adds a degree of social complexity because it makes it an ecological process assisted by conservationists. It makes it primarily a social process assisted by nature in that we bring them back. And that's the only way it's going to happen. In terms of the space, there's been quite a few studies now on the ecological feasibility of lynx reintroductions in England, Wales, mostly in Scotland, and there is suitable habitat and prey base, particularly of roe deer. Ireland, less so. We have less forest, and we don't actually have roe deer. So there's a debate about whether lynx could take sika deer, which are quite a bit bigger. They're an invasive deer species that can be quite a bit bigger than roe deer. With wolves, less research has been done, but there is one paper looking at suitability in the Scottish Highlands, which would be the biggest area of quote unquote wilderness in Britain and Ireland, and that there is certainly, I think, 20,000 kilometers squared of suitable habitat with high carrying capacity with deer that would be theoretically suitable for wolves. So on paper and in theory, and certainly in the pages of academic journals, the papers are coming out, the research is being done, but there is a conceptual thing here where we have in our minds an association between quote unquote wildness or wilderness and these species. They symbolize it as an idea, they symbolize it as a place, and they symbolize it as a process. So when you have these species, though, returning to places that we don't perceive of as wild enough, then it creates all sorts of problems for us conceptually and philosophically. Example of that is I went to see this farming family in the Netherlands who had lost 4 sheep to a wolf attack. And they live in a highly domesticated, intensively farmed landscape that in many ways is the antithesis of Yellowstone or the Tom Minor Basin or even the Scottish Highlands. It's neat fields and canals and trees lined with oak, or roads lined with oak trees. And they conceptually, never mind the fact that lost sheep and the compensation had been mishandled by the relevant government agency, that aside, conceptually, they said to me, these animals don't belong here. This is not wild enough for wolves. They belong maybe in the mountains of Europe, maybe in Switzerland. So I went to Switzerland, and even in the mountains and forests of Switzerland, the Swiss said, nope, wolves don't belong here. Try North America. Yellowstone, actually, that's where the wolves belong. And so I went to Montana and Colorado and Wyoming, and there were some people there who weren't too keen on wolves in certain places as well. And what I realized is everywhere I went, people was like, yeah, we don't hate wolves. We don't have a problem with them. We just don't want them in our backyard. I coined the term biological NIMBYism, that everybody loves a large carnivore, but not everybody loves it in their own backyard. So there's something there about, again, who controls space, but also conceptually, where is wild enough to have these species? Is it in the Yellowstones and the Serengetis, or is it also in the countryside where we have livestock and roads and wind turbines and human beings and human activities?
It's so interesting that you say that, because we've spoken with a couple of folks one who was tracking wolves in the Netherlands. We've spoken with some Caitlin McLean, who is she's originally from Scotland. She went over to Slovakia, and a couple other CCD Bernardi, who's in Sweden. And it's interesting that this concept of humans being really the powerful, surveyors of the land, saying what is wild enough for a creature that's been existing for hundreds of thousands of years in one form or another across many of these landscapes, well before Homo sapien or human came into the picture. So that's an interesting observation by you to see that, because we have established ourselves in certain parts of these countries and these hillsides and these countrysides to say, well, it's not wild enough anymore. it may used to have been and now it's not.
Hmm.
Where does that come from? Does this go back? Do we rewind back to the beginning when we started talking about power and who rules the land and who's in charge of what gets to stay and what doesn't?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things at work. I think there is this idea, especially in Europe, and Europe, for better or worse, exported it all the way around the world, including to North America. This idea of civilization. And that's what, yeah, quote unquote, you're rolling your eyes, whatever that might mean. But that, again, this is where symbols are so important, that animals like wolves, lynx, to a lesser extent, bears, symbolize the uncivilized. And Europe was in the process of civilizing and turning forest into field and turning woodland, putting it to the plow, and all of the there's some benefits from that and create more food production, growing population. It's easy to look back in time and judge our ancestors, as those who come after us will judge us for what we did and how we acted and
Of
thought. But
course.
I think there is definitely an element of these species symbolizing maybe even chaos, and the civilizing project that was Europe didn't feel that there was the room and the space for them. And they vanished from large parts of the continent, and they certainly vanished from Britain and Ireland. And that vanishing is permanent in ecological terms. Only we can bring them back. Whereas in much of Western Europe, on the same landmass, that recovery has, over the last 3 decades, has been really quite astonishing. I mean, it's amazing. As I'm sure your other guests have talked about, it is just astonishing. But at the same time, it brings some real, some perceived, and some symbolic risks and challenges for rural communities. And we have to take those seriously and listen to them, and make sure that we resource the solutions over long periods of time, not just over 5 years of a pilot project, but over decades. As a society, if we want to commit to coexistence, then we need to resource coexistence.
And I think you make such a valued point there about coexistence and compromise in that way, in understanding multiple points of view. And this is not to downplay any of the people that you spoke to, or take any opinions of those that are farming the land, or herding sheep, or doing any of these things on the land, and saying that any perception or reality is wrong. It's really about taking everything into account and having every voice at the table. Otherwise, as you say, an effort such as this to reintroduce a lynx or a wolf or a bear to Britain and Ireland it's going to be dead on arrival, because we won't factor in all of these ideas, all of these factors from every single group, and be able to have compensation plans. And you talk about money and finance, and how that has helped in the book, about money and finance, and how that has helped certain communities sort of get over the hump, or at least get towards the hump enough to say, okay, we can live with a depredation here or there because we're financially compensated and we have some non-coexistence tools.
Yeah.
In this instance, go ahead.
No, I just wanted, before we get into the like you say, the conversations about conservation, I just wanted to finish up with one observation about why I think we find it hard, like those Dutch farmers that I met, to conceptualize that wolves could be in a semi-domesticated or even very domesticated landscape. And that's because if you go back to my childhood watching David Attenborough documentaries, and he's not just a national treasure here in the UK, he's an international treasure. But a lot of those stories, especially in his earlier work, and a lot of wildlife documentaries, of which I am a big fan, I rarely saw people and large carnivores sharing landscapes. I saw large carnivores in quote unquote pristine national parks where there was maybe a scientist, maybe some tourists. In terms of the other side, in terms of a villain in the story, maybe a poacher. But I didn't see the stories of this messy sharing of space with the sheep farmer and the wolf pack and the conservationist and the tourism entrepreneur and the mining company because we need lithium for our batteries. I didn't see those stories. And there was a survey done at the end of 2023 of 10,000 rural Europeans across 10 countries. And it asked them to rank their sources of information about apex predators. And by quite some margin of over 20%, 49% or thereabouts said we get our information about apex predators where? from documentaries. So if the documentaries that we watch do not show us sharing landscapes with large carnivores and the messy realities, as well as the beautiful opportunities that that entails, then people are going to have this binary division in their minds and in the stories that they tell themselves and their children, that large carnivores belong over there and we belong over here, as opposed to, if we want flourishing planet with flourishes for people and predator alike, we need to find ways to share the spaces that are somewhere between the urban CBDs where we are and the inviolate cores of national parks where apex predators are. On the spectrum of landscape in between, we need to share landscapes with apex predators, and we need the stories to help us articulate what that looks like. That's why I wrote this book, to help us articulate that story.
And that's such an important and invaluable resource to have. And the experiences that you've had traversing across the globe, really, to talk about this. And you bring in your experiences with snow leopards as well. And that, I think, is a unique point that drives this predator coexistence. When we talk about something that's been missing from certain countries for hundreds of years at the very least, I mean, what really stands in the way of taking progressive action to enact something like this, to bring these predators over? Is it, and I think you talked about 4 or 5 things in the book, and I might have written, I think it was money, obviously, it was finance, a couple other things that you can please go into.
Yeah.
But I mean, I wrote down, money, time, investment, observation, non-lethal. I mean, there's a lot of factors to do the heavy lifting of actually bringing something like the lynx, just for instance, back. What are those things that stand in the way of this progressive action to be able to try this at the very least?
So I talk about in the book and also in the TED Talk, which maybe you can put in the show notes as well for people who have just 10 minutes or haven't read the book yet, what I call the coexistence toolkit, which is this tool of practical approaches that we can use to coexist with apex predators, but also with each other and our different perspectives on apex predators. Number one is the use of deterrence, so tools that disrupt the attack sequence of a predator on livestock. So shepherds, people being in landscapes, livestock guardian animals, fences, collars, corrals for nighttime protection, those sort of things. The second, as you've hinted at, is finance. So that means using compensation especially, but also insurance or proactive environmental performance payments to offset the costs and make sure that those losing livestock to apex predators are compensated for those financial losses. The third is more complex and controversial ethically, at least, and that is the use of force in terms of A, hazing, B, translocating, and sometimes the use of lethal control, especially when there is a pattern of predation with a problem animal that cannot be weaned off killing livestock, particularly. Although that, with wolves especially, in terms of what that can mean for disrupting pack structure, brings a whole set of ecological challenges as well, never mind the ethical. The fourth tool in the toolkit is enterprise. And whereas these other 3 tools are basically about stopping bad things from happening to livestock from predators and then fixing it whenever it happens, the enterprise one, and it's a topic close to my heart as a social entrepreneur, is about seeing the potential from predators in the landscape and seeing the opportunities that they bring, especially economically, for imagining new rural economies. And that is especially through tourism. And I was in Yellowstone in the fall of 23, and the traffic jams whenever there was a bison or a buffalo or elk, or never mind a wolf, man, the traffic jam when we saw a wolf, like, it was out of San Francisco. It was the worst traffic I met in North America. Incredible. But also, as well as tourism, hunting, and then predator friendly certification schemes where farmers are producing under a mark or getting a premium for producing in a predator friendly way and selling it again to, say, urban consumers who want to have these animals on the land and can support it with their purchases of wolf predator friendly lamb or a hypothetical lynx friendly wool or something like that. Those are all quite technical tools. They're things that we do and they're important. But the danger sometimes in a lot of conservation has been to just see it as a topic of natural science that natural science data alone will solve. And that's really important. It's a foundation of what we do. Nevertheless, conservation is also a social process. It's something that we do. And conservation and conversation and conservation are exactly the same words, just with letters in different places. So the last tool in the toolkit, in my view, is also the most important tool in the toolkit, and that is governance. And it is the foundation on which all of these other technical approaches rest, because governance is fundamentally relational. And coexistence, yes, there are technical aspects to it. Do you have a livestock guardian dog or a livestock guardian lamb or a livestock guardian donkey? But fundamentally, coexistence is about relationships with each other, with ourselves, and with nature. And governance provides the mechanisms at local all the way through to international to share space, to share that common ground, to try and reconcile those different visions for the land, those different competing uses, those different value sets that underpin it, and find ways to compromise, ways to conflict within boundaries, to solve conflicts when they arise, and they will arise, because coexistence is not all motherhood and apple pie. Some of these, as my colleague Ray Gonzalez at Colorado State would say, with apex predators, they can become intractable identity-based conflicts. And I talk about, therefore, addressing conservation conflicts as opposed to solving conservation conflicts. But there is great merit in that process of addressing conservation conflicts through governance. And it is that final tool in the toolkit that will be key in Britain and Ireland to making it work. I would say governance is the single most important thing as to whether these projects succeed in the future.
How do you start the conversation about conservation in regards to England and Ireland, and you getting the base and the foundation to start to have the governance in place to use the tools in the toolkit?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I have chosen a position within this debate in my native Britain and Ireland of being somewhat in the middle because of my unique background and skill set, because I love farmers and farming, but I also love conservationists and rewilders and reintroducers, and I love the species underneath, whether it's lynx, wolves, and bears. I also love cattle, sheep, and goats. And I think it is easier. My point is that when conversations are led by any organization that wants something to happen, they're automatically perceived by the other side. This is on any topic. The other side is not being a neutral arbiter or even a safe pair of hands. And I wonder, and I see that, and there's been some decent work done by Lynx reintroduction coalitions in Britain, both in Northern England and Scotland, which built on the back of a really badly handled effort about 10 years ago by an organisation called the Lynx UK Trust that was very technocratic and top down. A lot of shenanigans going on that I heard about. And I think the brand has been tarred still by association with that badly handled effort 10 years ago. So in Ireland, the lesson of that is, if you're going to do it the first time, don't make a mess of it. The legal and organizations who are now working on it in Britain and Ireland, they still, I guess they want it to happen. Sheep farmers and agricultural organizations generally don't. And I think my point is, again, relating it back to governance, that it's really important to have neutral, trusted intermediaries in the middle who can facilitate conversations and facilitate dialogue. And I think we, instead of saying it as a binary us and them, I think we need to see more of that in Britain and Ireland on this issue. And I've a couple of weeks ago, months ago, I was talking to sheep farmers at the behest of the National Sheep Organisation. I just try to have dialogue with everybody and meet people where they're at and see what happens. But again, it comes back to, I guess, the power dynamics in this. In the research for the book, I interviewed farming leaders and rewilding leaders across Britain and Ireland about this topic. And I was struck by a couple of things. Just the general feel that I had from my interviews with farmers is that they felt on the back foot, they felt pessimistic about the future, they felt defensive, whereas the rewilding leaders who were talking about reintroducing lynx, they felt optimistic about the future, they felt like their momentum and maybe even morality and ethics certainly was on their side. They felt like they were going forwards. And that kind of differences in emotions or difference in mindset has made me since think that it's hard to have balanced conversations between two groups, one that feels like it's going forward and the other group at the same time is having to walk backwards to accommodate that group. That is not a great place to start an equal conversation, I think. And I don't have an answer or a fix to that, but I would say again, the need for intermediaries who can broker conversations in those sorts of places strikes me as something that's really important.
I know this is a loaded question, sort of general. And those of you, we will have a link to Jonny's TED Talk there and links for the book and things of that sort, just to put that out there. Those of you that are listening. Overall, do you believe there is a pathway to coexistence with predators in England and Ireland?
And Scotland and Wales.
And Scotland and Wales. Sorry, all of them. Okay. I apologize, my Scottish and Wales listeners. Please, I apologize. Thank you, Jonny.
With apex predators specifically, yes, I think so. I think right now it's tricky, and I wrote the conclusion of my book exactly a year before we had the illegal releases at the start of this year, and I said it was tricky at this moment. And I think that in the short term, those illegal releases have made it even harder because the conspiracy mills on all sides is in full flow, and it has broken trust. And one of the fundamental currencies of human relationships is trust, and that has caused a lot of problems in the short term. What it also has meant is that the Scottish First Minister, like the Scottish Prime Minister, effectively has, as a reaction to that, put a red pen through the legal attempts to reintroduce Lynx. But I think, again, part of the problem with this is that we tend to think in very short-term cycles as human beings. We think about the next quarter. We think about the next 2 quarters. We don't think about the next quarter century or the next 2 quarter centuries, 50 years. And yet when we think about, not even in geological terms, but even in terms of managing and owning land, when we do those ecological forecasts for population and habitat and prey base in Britain and Ireland, we're usually using the benchmark of 100 years. And on my travels across the world, when these species return, often the debates about it take place over not just a few years, but over decades. So I think we need to lengthen the time frame within which we think about this. And while I think it is particularly challenging at the moment, I think the conditions are going to change in the future to make it not only more likely, but easier to make it work. And partly that is because in upland areas, partly to meet climate change goals, we will need to see a lot more afforestation. And as that forestry increases, the deer population will also increase to fill that space. And there will be, therefore, we're creating even more of the habitat and prey base for this. The other thing is that I think there will be increasing popular support over time for this idea. Many people in Britain and Ireland, maybe even a majority outside of vocal minorities opposed and against, are still just waking up to the idea that we may have these species back just as we once had them. And again, that takes a lot of time to sink into people's psyche, to see that it's an opportunity in many ways, to think about how we might address the challenges. And other practical things in terms of how farming in upland areas, the reintroduction sites, there will probably be less farming of sheep in the future, maybe cattle replacing them or forestry replacing them, and that will automatically reduce the scope for that competition for that same piece of land. So I think in the short term, I think it's pretty difficult in the short term. I think it's got even more difficult in 2025. But I think in the long term, at some point, all of the factors will coalesce into making it easier, not easy, but easier.
I mean, words definitely matter, and I think reactionary is a great term that is used. I think in a lot of things we see it here in the United States when it comes to environmental policy. Is there's a reaction to something, and so there's the heavy hand wields whatever the ruling is, and then you have to draw things back. And so it's hopefully the reaction is less over there with England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales to take the proper steps to talk to everyone that could be and should be involved to make this a process. And as we've covered, it's such a complex is overused, but it's not in this instance because it is such an entanglement between history and money and everything else that just lines any sort of debate surrounding predators of any type in any situation. Jonny, my last question for you. No, go ahead if you want to.
I was just going to say it is complex and contested, and it's going to be costly as well. But I would to me, it's important to hold on to the common ground in all of this, that whether sheep farmer radically, vehemently opposed or Lynx reintroducer vehemently in favor, that we still love the places that we come from, and we love the landscapes that we live in, urban, rural, or somewhere in between, and we desire good things for those places. And that shared belief is an important thing to remember in all of this. And I hope we can find some way to compromise and have a shared vision where we can have that common ground in relation to apex predator reintroductions.
Absolutely. I agree with you. My last question for you, Jonny, and I'll ask this because it is the part of your book. When you hear the word lynx, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
I'm gonna have to say that deodorant now. It's just stuck in my mind. And we have I had these terribly corny ads maybe, I don't know, like 10, 15 years ago called the Lynx effect. I don't know if you have it with Axe.
Maybe, it's possible.
Kind of dated and stereotypical, which I'm not going to get into. But anyway, I did a video recently calling about the Lynx effect in relation to these illegal releases and I said basically the idea repels some because of potential threats, real or perceived threats to livelihood, but it attracts others because these species symbolize and may usher in ecological restoration. So I know as a large carnivore conservationist, I should not end the podcast talking about deodorants, but it's stuck in my mind now, as well as 70 million other people who live in Britain and Ireland.
I mean, hey, you got to speak your truth, and that's totally fine. Listen, anybody who's listening, I highly recommend this. Living with Lynx, sharing landscapes with big cats, wolves, and bears. Add it to your collection. Jonny Hanson has done an incredible job, and it's food for thought for anyone who's in the conservation space, who's in the farming space, and really takes a look at everything all across the globe and how we can possibly do this. So, Jonny, thank you for taking the time, for going in depth with me and sharing my love of history with both of your countries, and just appreciate your time. This is really fantastic. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure, John. Thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Just hang tight while we sign off. How's to you all out there? We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.